You know, I moved out here to Michigan when my son first got married, back in 2011. I did this so I could be closer to my grandchildren, and while I love being out here, I never knew that I would have my house stalked by these strange creatures. I don't know what they are, but I sure as heck know they aren't normal. I'll go into detail about the first encounter if you let me, but first, I have to promise you that you'll keep this between us, at least my name. You could share the story, but don't share my name. Okay then, here goes. I moved out here in August of 2011 and started settling into my new house near the end of October. It took a few months to fully move in. It was an older farmhouse on a decent-sized plot of land just outside of Ann Arbor, and while it needed some work when I bought it, it was still a pretty nice house for me. The first real night that I laid down in the house, I could not sleep for some reason. Well, around 2 a.m, I heard something rustling around outside, and once again, I could not get to sleep, so I decided to go outside and investigate. Call me crazy, but I wasn't scared. It was dark out, but the moon was lit enough that you could make out what was going on and where you were going. Not a full moon, but enough illumination. As soon as I stepped out the door, I see this huge black dog standing no more than 20 feet away from me, staring at me. Now, I'm not scared of dogs, but this thing was massive, easily the size of a German Shepherd, and it was also bipedal and had a very weird-looking head. It didn't have fur, but instead appeared to be covered in some kind of glistening skin, like dark scales. Its eyes were this brightish yellowish green that shone in the moonlight, and the next thing I know, it's running towards me. I freaked out, ran back inside the house, slamming the door. I told my son and daughter-in-law about it, and they laughed in my face, said I was probably just saying things because I was so tired. But I was wired at this point, and I don't think I slept at all. The next night, the same thing happened. This was clearly no dog. But this time, I watched it as it ran off into the woods, and once again, my son had told me I'd probably just seen a coyote or something, or maybe a big feral cat, possibly an ocelot. The next day, I decided to call up the local game warden, ask him what kind of creatures were indigenous to this area. He laughed in my face too, at me for being worried about a Hollywood wolfman, but then stopped when I started telling him my encounter. I don't know how much longer this went on for because I'm too afraid to even go outside alone at night. And one morning, around 4 or 4:30, I heard these huge thumps coming from on top of my roof, and I knew whatever it was up there. So I grabbed a baseball bat, expecting World War III to happen, and I could see this black creature crouching down in the corner right near the sunroom. It was about 7 feet tall, bipedal, reddish-orange eyes that were glowing in the dark, and had this strange-looking head and muzzle. It was different looking than the other one I saw. Oh, and by the way, yes, this farmhouse had a sunroom addition. I think it was partially used as a flower room, like a garden room, if that makes any sense. It roared at me as it saw me through the glass and started jumping down, lumbering towards the door. I got ready to swing and ready to smack it in the head if I could. I ran, throwing my bat down out of fear, calling the police. The police didn't really take me seriously and took their time getting out there. They told me, though, that they found one of my neighbors who were also attacked by this thing, and they'd apparently taken his statement too, so I'm not really sure what to make of all this. And a friend of mine that lives around here also talked about finding a huge coyote ripped in pieces. This is probably no more than a mile away from my house. I feel like something evil is out here. And my son and daughter-in-law still keep trying to convince me I'm hallucinating, and the whole Michigan Dogman thing is just a joke, a legend, not real. And they're telling me I'm not getting enough sleep, that I need sleeping pills and I'm hallucinating. But I know what I saw, and there's no way that this thing is just a wolfman. It's evil. I'm a paramedic here in Oregon. I have been for quite some time. I'm actually in my 20 years of service, and I've seen some pretty explicit things. Things you honestly wouldn't believe. Also, I stand a bit more on the skeptical side of most things. including the paranormal, Bigfoot, and all of that nonsense. I do hold a bachelor's in biology from OSU, and I'm very familiar with taxonomy and anatomy, but I'm not prone to hallucinations or any sort of delusional thinking. I am 100% convinced that what I saw that was real, and it has not been documented before, at least to my thorough understanding. It's made me reevaluate and rethink about the way I think about the world, science, and what's true and what's not. Anyway, I live and work primarily in Central Oregon, and I spend a lot of time around Warm Springs Reservation here in Oregon. A lot of my family is from there, since I am half native. This summer, 2015, I was up at my family's cabin with some close friends of mine, and we all saw something we could not explain. It was in the early evening hours. We were sitting outside, having beers, enjoying the warm weather with our dogs, and we all heard it. A very loud howl-type noise. It stopped us all cold. Then, there was silence for about 3 seconds before another one sounded off closer to us. This one was louder, and much more profound in volume and power. We all looked at each other thinking, what is that? My buddy goes inside, grabs his .22. I grab my shotgun. We also grabbed our dogs and went into the cabin, locking the door, turning off all the lights. My friend started panicking. I guess his father had dealt with creatures like this before in the woods, and he started mumbling and stuttering, telling me that this is not good, that we've angered the beast. Even though I grew up around a lot of Warm Springs natives, I'm actually not that proficient in the language, and he started praying and speaking to me in that language, none of which I really understood. Maybe a few words here and there, but nothing I could really make out. And finally, after some more time had passed, we decided everything was okay, and we went back outside, with our dogs, of course. We decided to try and relax a little bit more and sit in the same spot we were earlier, when my friend motioned it that there was this large bipedal dog walking through the trees, roughly 50 yards away from us. It was definitely not a normal dog. It was much too big and reminded me of a wolf. It also had a very awkward gait, and the hair on its back was standing up, and it had a very long snout. I pointed it out to my friends, too. We watched it as it moved across a clearing and then disappearing behind some trees. We had a very clear view of it, and I wished that I had taken a picture or shot video on my phone, but we were all just in shock by what we were seeing. My one friend was virtually on the end of a panic attack. It did not appear to be somebody in a costume, as some have suggested before. This was a full-on flesh and blood creature. I know this might sound crazy, but I swear on my life that what I saw was real. At least what I know is real. As in something physical. Something you could touch and see. It was moving pretty quick, like it was going somewhere. Once it fully disappeared, we retired back into the cabin for the evening and the rest of the night. I don't think any of us were really comfortable sitting out there anymore. At least not after that sighting. That was a little too much for me. I'm a fairly reliable person when it comes to sighting strange creatures. I was raised in the country and have been around all sorts of wild animals my entire life. I am also a very experienced hunter and tracker, and have spent many years in the field and through my passions. About 10 years ago, when I was living in Colorado State, I saw a cryptid that has forever changed the way I think about the world. Now, I was out deer hunting one morning when a friend of mine, we were walking through some dense woods, and I saw something moving in the bushes nearby. At first, I figured it might be a deer, but then we saw the shape, and we saw that it was probably a wolf. And then it did something like stand up, and I realized what we were dealing with in that moment was far stranger. It was a bipedal dog-like creature, roughly 6 feet tall, reddish-brown fur, and standing on its hind legs. I noticed it had long, sharp claws. It was looking at us with a look of intense hatred. My friend saw it too. His jaw just dropped, and we both just stood there, staring at it in complete disbelief. Thankfully, this creature did not attack us, and just swiftly and quickly disappeared back into the woods. I still can't explain what I saw that day, but it was definitely something strange like a cryptid. I've never seen anything like it before, and I'm convinced that it roams in those woods. Now, the second experience I had happened years later, in a different part of Colorado. This was early morning, and I was driving to work on a rural highway. This cuts right through the foothills of the Rocky Mountains. As I rounded a bend in the road, I saw something standing in the middle of the asphalt. At first, I thought it was a large dog, and had completely forgotten about my sighting from years before. As I got closer, though, I could see that it was much too big and dark to be a dog. Then it also stood up, and I could see its features better. It had a long wolf-like snout. The creature was covered in dark fur, and I could see its muscles rippling as it stood there watching me. I was overcome with fear and paralyzed. I could not make my car move an inch. It eventually turned and loped off into the woods. I did not see it again afterwards, but I'll never forget that sight, and all the feelings, emotions, and memories of the first sighting came rushing back in full. And since this, I've heard many other reports of similar creatures from all over the country. Some people refer to them as cryptids. Others call them monsters. Whatever you want to call them, they're out there, and they're definitely something to be afraid of. If you are ever out in the wilderness and see one of these creatures, don't try to approach it. Just get away as fast as you can, and remember, it's better to be safe than sorry. So, next time you're in Colorado, keep your eyes peeled for any strange creatures lurking in the shadows. You never know when you might encounter one of these terrifying cryptids. Please, I urge you, be careful out there. This world is a scary place. In eastern Texas, I was born and raised. I'm 33 years old, and am kind of an outdoor junkie. I hunt, I fish, etc. I feel pretty confident in saying that I know the woods like the back of my hand. Growing up in eastern Texas, you quickly learn to identify every animal by its track, sound, and behavior. I have also had some thorough experience with sightings of strange beings, like Bigfoot, for example. Eastern Texas seems to be a hotbed for this kind of stuff. In fact, I've spent many months out in the woods, fishing, so I know the sounds of the woods and the things the animals make. A few weeks back, I was driving from San Antonio to visit some friends. I was taking back roads, as I always do, to enjoy the scenery and get a little exercise. I like to stop and go marching through the woods. San Antonio is pretty dry, so it's not like eastern Texas. I do enjoy time with my friends. Marching through the timber in the middle of the day in central Texas is great, albeit strenuous activity. Even though I was raised around here, I'd never been down this road before. It's pretty secluded and not uncommon to see deer, hogs, and other wildlife. As I was walking, getting ready to head back to the car to continue my long trek, I heard a sound that I immediately knew was nothing normal. It sounded like a dog howling, but was much deeper in pitch, and there was something weird about it. It sounded distorted and wrong. I stopped in my tracks, slowly turning around to face the direction the sound came from. I could see something coming out of a small meadow into a small clearing. It was maybe 30 yards away, and I see a creature that I can only describe as an upright wolf. It was standing strong, had the body of Arnold Schwarzenegger in the movie Conan the Barbarian, and the head reminded me somewhat of a black Labrador. Its head was not human, and the face was twisted in a demonic grimace. It was staring right at me, and it let out this other high-pitched, distorted noise. I immediately dropped everything I was doing and started running towards my car. I've been working at this textile industry for over 5 years now, and as part of the security. Since I'm one of the oldest workers here, compared to most of the other security guys, I know pretty much all corners and spots of the facility, including parts I even doubt the owner knows about, because he rarely visits it. Anyway, it helps a lot when I want to go somewhere alone to relax a bit, or go for a smoke break. Nobody is really bothered by it. Some of these spots are not covered by security cameras either. One day, while I was working with 3 of my colleagues, they asked if they could skip the night shift and go out for some drinks instead, because one of them had his birthday. I could not refuse and felt a little jealous that they had a good friendship and I didn't. But I didn't mind. So I told them they could just leave and have fun. I would cover for them. Besides, nobody ever visited or checked out who was on the security watch. Since it was quite part of the city, there was little to no suspicious activity that would need a closer inspection or reporting. So, after they went out just a little before midnight, I sat in my chair with the surveillance on almost 15 cameras in front of me while I watched episodes on my tablet. Occasionally, I would glance at the screen to see if everything was in order, and it was like it usually had been. A few hours later, though, I went back to the room next door for making coffee for myself. I had started to feel a little drowsy. When I came back, I saw something moving across the screen on the north side of the industry, the outer perimeter, where we usually hang all the freshly dyed stuff that would dry overnight to be processed further. I rushed to the screen, following the next camera that would cover the spot. I saw something pass by. I saw it only for a few seconds, but I could tell it was a wolf. I didn't get a good look, though, because the cameras aren't exactly designed for viewing perfect details at night, so I couldn't say anything more. But then, I noticed movement on a different camera. It didn't look like an animal or a wolf. I very clearly saw a figure standing on two legs and gray-yellow shiny eyes, like a cat's glows in the dark. That alone put me on edge. And even ironically, the figure disappeared into the corner of the same drying room and wasn't covered by the cameras. I waited. I kept an eye on all the screens to see if I could find anything, but did not. That's when I thought it was too suspicious that somebody like that was roaming around in the factory at that hour. I should go check it out. I should have always learned better. After seeing so many horror movies, where going alone at night is always a bad idea. I stepped outside with the light in one hand, and my hand was on my gun. The section where I saw the figure and the wolf is like a good 10-minute walk from the security office. So by the time I got there, I was sure that whoever it was would have been gone, if it didn't mean any harm. So I slowed down, moved carefully as to not make any sound, and stayed alert the entire time. Then I heard a low growl and the tearing of clothes along the slight splashes, as if somebody was wringing wet clothes. I looked to find a dark-colored cloth fallen over something. It looked like a wolf. It was sniffing the other cloth. And then I saw its ears move, and it stood on two legs, like I was standing. It was so big, twice my size, I would say, and I have a pretty good build. When it stood, the cloth fell over, and I saw it wasn't a man or a wolf. It was a beast that was half man, half wolf. It turned around and stared at me with the same gray-yellow eyes, the same ones I had seen before in the camera, and growled. I dropped the light, running in the opposite direction, as fast as I could, and made my way back to the security office without turning back or trying to see if the thing was following me or not. I was afraid. I felt like my heart would come out at any moment, and I was running out of breath. It didn't matter at that time. All that was in my mind was that I had to run and run until I was inside the security office. I slammed the door open, closing it behind me, locking it, believing that it would hopefully be enough to stop the thing from getting to me if it did come after me. I went back to the security room where the surveillance cameras sat and screens, looked for the one that showed the scene just outside the office door. I think I stopped breathing when I saw this werewolf thing walking up to the door, casually, and standing there, waiting for a few seconds. After a while, it turned around, away from the property. I followed its trail through the cameras, but did not relax until I had seen it completely step away from place. I was positive this thing was going to break the door down and rip me from limb to limb. I just sat there, collapsing in my chair, and did not move again until morning, my eyes glued to the screens the entire time. When my colleagues eventually returned, I told them everything. They didn't believe me at first, but I showed them the recorded parts of the cameras from the night. They were speechless. I wish I could show you the same footage, but it's owned by my company, and I don't think they'd want me sneaking that out. I grew up in a relatively quiet town just outside of Boise. Much of my early life was consisted of helping Mom and Dad out on the ranch, tending the horses and animals. When we weren't doing that, my father was teaching me how to hunt, track, you name it. So I feel I'm qualified to say what I saw might not be the usual Bigfoot. It was January, I remember that, and well below freezing. The wind was howling so loud you could hear it roaring in your ears, even if you had earmuffs on. And my father and brother and I were all wearing them. It really is too much trouble to go into all the details, but these events transpired over a period of 2 days. We were out tracking a wounded deer, a very large buck, mind you, the largest we had seen in a couple years. The blood trail led us to a stand of trees maybe about 200 yards square. We were each taking turns circling, trying to find where the deer had gone down. I was on my third lap around the tree stand when something was moving in the shadows. At first, maybe it was just another deer, but I got closer. I could see that it was something much different. This was no deer. In fact, it had a long snout and a body covered. The eyes were a deep, dark green and seemed to glow in the darkness. It was standing on 2 legs too, and was taller than my dad, who's 6'4". I froze, not knowing what to do. As soon as it saw me, it started moving quickly towards my direction. I realized I had no choice. I turned and ran as fast as I could, not wanting to be this next thing's kill. But it was gaining on me very quickly. I could hear my dad and brother calling my name, but I could not stop to answer them. I was almost to the edge of the trees when it caught up with me, knocking me to the ground, and a claw swiped down on my body. That was the last I remember. I lost consciousness. That's my story. The next thing I know, I wake up and my dad's dragging me back to the house. I suffered some pretty deep gashes in my body, but I guess what had happened is this thing was going to kill me, and my dad fired 2 shots at it and chased it off. I was only out for maybe 12 minutes. I'm very lucky that I survived. I also wanted to add that I've been having the similar experiences since this time that I was almost killed. Lights going out, strange sounds. I live in an area where a bear attack has been occurring frequently. I've also had them in my yard and on my porch. In fact, there's one nearby hiking trail that is notorious for people going missing or being mauled by an animal. I've been having trouble sleeping lately from all the bear activity. So I took a sleeping pill and one night woke up to something licking the window. It was gone by the time I opened my eyes, but whatever it was appeared canid from what I could tell, not to mention all the large canine tracks around my window. I think it's the same creature that's been following me since I was a teenager. It must have got a taste of my blood and wants more. Everything they teach you growing up hunting, to never run from a predator, all that went out the window the second I saw this thing. My car was about a quarter mile away at this point, and I knew if this thing began to chase after me, I was probably a dead man. Well, sure enough it did. But somehow, it allowed me to get to the car and jump in. I tore down the road, looking back to see if it had chased me. It was standing there in the middle of the road, looking back at me, and I'll never forget its expression on its face, as if it had pure rage, like I invaded its territory. What I don't understand is, the thing could have easily caught up to me if it wanted to, but it was like trying to chase me out of the territory, like it wanted to try and play with its prey, or so that's the way I feel about it. Now, this next part is kind of crazy. I've never really told anybody this story before. It just sounds insane, I know. After I got home and calmed down, I tried to do some research on Dogman, and found out there had been numerous sightings of all these creatures over the country. I vividly remember the wet popping noises it made as it pulled itself up from 4 legs to 2 and started running. I also remember that smell it left in the air. But that's as far as my memory goes. Apparently, This creature is supposed to be able to run over 30 miles an hour and jump well over 15 feet from a standing position. That's what I've heard. After I drove back home, I had to tell my friends that my trip would be delayed. They understood. I told them what had happened to me. Surprisingly, they believed me. I've also spoke about this to a few friends of mine that are into hunting and tracking too. They all agree this was not something normal or a case of a misidentification. They've all heard the stories of Dogman, but never thought they were real, or thought they were just in Michigan. I know what I saw, and it was definitely not a deer, a hog, or any other wild animal. One friend actually supposedly had a sighting a couple years ago in South Texas. She claims that it too was standing in the middle of the road, blocking her car, and she tried to make an aggressive move towards it. It disappeared. I think she told me she tried to run it over with her truck. I realize this sounds nuts, but please, take me seriously when I say that I want to know that it wasn't human nor animal. This was something else. Her claims that this thing spoke telepathically to her and told her it was going to rip her throat out. I'm not sure if I believe that part or not, but the fact remains, this thing is very real. I understand this might be hard to believe, and I don't expect you guys to believe me. I'm just letting you know that this is something out there, and if anybody else has had the same experience, they should come forward. Hi, my name is Michael. I'm 27, and the story I'm about to tell is an event that happened when I was a kid. I lived in a small town in Texas, closer to the border of New Mexico. I grew up in the desert and still live there, albeit in California. Our house was on a ranch, and we looked after cattle and kept a few dogs and cats as pets. I remember when I was around 14, I had a particularly hard time on the farm. Money was not abundant, and cattle would start to appear wounded or dead. The first animals appeared wounded out of the limits of the fences. My father could not explain it. We had goats, and my mom would use the milk to prepare cheese and sell it at the fairs. At the same time, our local government stopped issuing the monetary stimulus, and our farm suffered because of it. My eldest sister was working as a teacher in the city, and then she'd send us money when she could. I remember my father would get worried and made me help him reinforce the fences, even if we both knew the fences were fine. Our dogs would start randomly barking at night. It was a hot mess. I know my parents tried to put on a strong front for me, but I'm sure they were just as scared as I was. Things stopped when my mother talked with an indigenous friend of hers who told us we got a trabajo, an ill-natured magical work like a curse on us. She frequently traveled between Mexico and the USA, visiting relatives, and things eventually got solved. The event that scared me happened before that. It was a hot summer night, I remember. I could not fall asleep and felt nervous for no reason. My parents were asleep, and I heard the dogs walking downstairs, also acting very nervous. I tried to ignore them until I heard a loud bam outside, and just realized something was going on. I went downstairs and stared at the window. My dogs were running from one point in the living room to the other, barking at something, and the cats were hiding together. I heard sounds outside, coming from the cattle, and was about to grab my shotgun. Please, it's normal to carry them when you live outdoors, for your own protection, and run outside to get the chupacabras or whatever was attacking our cattle when everything suddenly gets silent. My dogs began whining, scared. I suppose they were running before following the movements of whatever was outside. And now, it must have been close to us. I began feeling this fear. Was it in my house? Why would I be scared? And suddenly, the strangest looking dog. It stood up right in front of my window. Its head was something between a dog and a wolf, muzzles and all, and very pointed ears. But it had the proportions of a human body. I yelled like crazy and heard my parents upstairs. The animal wasn't in front of me anymore. I explained to my parents what happened, and my dad went outside to chase what was harming my cattle, while my mom yelled at him to please stop. He returned with no news, except that he saw a silhouette of more dead animals. The next morning, I go out with my father, and we see these strange canine tracks. Huge, only in a zigzag pattern between two not messy footprint animals leave behind. It walked bipedally. Those were paws. I've grown up in the Midwest for many years of my life, so you would expect that a silly Dogman legend wasn't something I would ever believe in, right? Well, I had an experience that would prove to me to be very real. I was out working on my truck in a remote area near a creek bed. The area now was mostly developed. I had this strange feeling of being watched. I turned around and see this large, bipedal dog-like creature standing no more than 25 yards away. It was very, very large, taller than any man, and very muscular. The skin was a dark blackish color, and it had a very long snout with sharp teeth. I was completely stunned and didn't know what it was, but the thing stared at me with an intensity that shook my soul. It took a few seconds to find my voice, but once I did, I started yelling obscenities at it. The creature just tilted its head to the left, looked at me, quizzically, then cocked its head to the right. The whole time, it never took its eyes off me. It stared at me like a dead, dying deer, getting ready to pounce on its next meal. After about 30 seconds, it appeared to grow bored of me. Maybe I wasn't scared enough. It turned around quite gracefully, actually, and walked away at this inhuman speed. I don't know why. I was terrified beyond relief. And that night, I could not bring myself to get drunk enough to erase the memory from my mind. I'm not sure what to make of it, but at that time, I was convinced that this was a Dogman, and that the legends were real. It's the only thing that makes sense if you think about it. I didn't just hallucinate this whole experience because I was drunk. Also, the behavior of the creature was completely typical of a Dogman in so many ways, after reading up on it. The dark blackish skin color, the bipedal stance, and the very muscular bulk physique, and even the long hair were all consistent with reported behavior. As for why it didn't attack me, who knows? Maybe Dogmen have a strict policy against who and who they can't go after. I'm not sure why it chose to leave instead of attacking. Maybe it has something to do with Dogmen being a lesser evil than the aliens they work for. There also seems to be a lot of evidence that point towards these creatures having been created by the Greys as an inferior race that can be used to perform tasks deemed too dangerous or possibly distasteful for humans. Maybe Dogmen are hybrids that were genetically engineered by the Greys themselves before they were bred with wolves to produce a more resilient canine species, like the one I saw. All speculation and theories, of course. I have also been told by a credible source that the government is well aware of the existence and has been for some time, but they will always refuse to admit it. Anyway, I don't know what this thing is or where it came from, but I know it exists. I have never seen anything like it since or before. I know what I saw, and I know how terrifying it can be seeing this thing. Back in May of 2001, I was helping my brother repaint his old barn. This barn is located in the middle of hundreds of acres of woodland, so we had to cut through woods to get there. Now, this isn't normal country, like out west or anything. This is countryside with farms and whatnot. Anyway, about a fourth mile into the woods, I saw something that has haunted me ever since. First of all, I'm from Kentucky, Louisville to be exact. The reason being is because I've been a cryptozoology nut since the age of 7, when I saw my first episode of In Search Of with Leonard Nimoy. What happened was that one night while watching TV, a program called The American Sportsman came on. The show was about hunting big game in different parts of the world. The episode I saw was about a man who went to Africa to hunt a lion. I don't remember all the details, but what I do remember is that the lion was wounded by the hunter and ran into some thick brush. The cameraman followed the lion, thinking he had lost it in the brush, when out of nowhere, this huge thing bounds at the cameraman. The camera goes into a frantic blur and all you could hear is growling and screaming. I remember that when my mom walked into the room, She saw me sitting there with tears running down my face because I was so scared. Now, keep in mind, I was only 7 at the time, but that image has been stuck with me ever since, and has further fueled my interest in cryptozoology. Even though they're hardly related, for whatever reason, those two just make a connection in my mind. So, when I say I've seen some weird stuff, you have to understand where I'm coming from. Anyway, and back to the story. I had my hunting rifle with me because you never know, right? You should always go armed. After about an hour of walking through the wilderness, I finally reached the barn that my brother wanted to paint. When I got there, I noticed something was strange. There was a weird-looking rock lying on the ground next to 3 logs. There were also some pieces of meat that had been left there. Now, I'm not a hunter, but I know that deer don't eat rocks, and there was no blood trail leading to or from the rock. So I began thinking maybe I'd walked into some kind of trap. That's kind of what it looked like. I started to get a little spooked at this point. I decided to take a quick look around the barn, but as soon as I stepped out from behind the building, I saw it. Standing no more than 100 yards away in a clearing was this giant black creature, easily 8 feet tall, that had the head that looked like a dog's. The body was covered in black fur and standing on 2 legs. I could see its eyes glowing in the darkness, and I could hear it snarling. I froze and just stared at it, and then it began to move towards me. At this point, fear had taken over, and all I could do was run. I ran back to the woods, straight home. When I got there, I locked all the doors, never telling my wife what exactly happened because I didn't think she would believe me. The next day, I went back to the barn with a video camera, hoping to film any evidence of what I'd seen, but when I got there, the pieces of bloody meat and the rocks were gone. I even walked over to where I'd seen the creature standing and found some unusual footprints in the dirt. The prints were canid, and about 12 inches long and 8 inches wide at the back. Each toe or paw was roughly 4 inches long and pointed straight down, like a dog's paw. I never did find out what it was that I saw, but it's always stayed with me, and to this day, I still can't explain what I saw in those woods. The story I'm about to refer to is an event that happened when I was visiting my grandparents in Paraguay. They lived in a town, not even a farm, which is what makes it scarier for me. This is a legend that talks about a strange creature, similar to the werewolf of European folklore, though I think this is more the action of Christian lore and European tales. The Lobosón is said to be the 7th son of a mythical couple, cursed to have monstrous offspring. The myth is extended across Uruguay, the south of Brazil, and the north of Argentina, where people historically lived and still lived. According to the modern versions of the legend, this creature is the 7th son who transforms once he reaches adolescence and is associated with death. Specifically, associated with death, it is said to feed on corpses and eat the souls of the living. In my grandparents' town, people would speak about this creature. There were tales and anecdotes, but at the same time, people are really superstitious and it's a very taboo subject. My parents would speak about it and sometimes would refrain to do so. They would get annoyed. Same with neighbors. I suppose people saw me as this annoying city kid attracting bad luck for touching upon bad topics and stuff like that. Nothing ever happened while I visited them in their own town, and believe me, I walked around the place at late hours. Nothing ever happened to me, except for one night. I returned from dinner at a friend's place. That town is a calm place where there was almost no crime. You could, and still can, walk around, and it was safe. It was around 2 a.m, and I was a few blocks away from my grandparents' house. There are lots of old but simple houses there. I was walking, and then saw this abnormally big street dog appearing out of nowhere. It had black fur, and looked very dirty. I paid it no mind because that's a common thing to see here. Some street dogs are better left alone. Some are good, and others are aggressive. I kept walking until I feel this sudden cold. I looked towards the direction of the dog. It was standing on its hind legs and grunting at me. I realized things were bad, really bad. No dogs walk like that. Its eyes were yellow, and standing up it was very tall and unnatural. It looked at me and I felt this sudden dread. An irrational fear grew inside me. I turned on my heels and ran away, fast. I wasn't thinking, just running. I felt it chasing me and the fear turned into terror. I ran and ran and ran, jumping over the fence of my friend's house, where his own dog began to bark at me, and it equally scared me. And his dad appeared looking very angry and saw me nearly crying in his front yard. It was then that I had to be escorted by him to my grandparents' house. He kept talking about me using incenses to clean myself and all of this as we walked. I remember my grandparents were more than mad. They were scared. They told me it would be better for me to return with my parents in the city for my safety. And that's how this creature ruined one of my summer visits at my grandparents'. I'm a former Marine and current law enforcement officer. I've been around weapons and hunting my whole life. I'm also extremely familiar with animal behavior. With that said, I know what I saw was not a bear, deer, or any other native animal to Colorado. I was out hunting one time with my younger brother, who is also law enforcement, and 2 other friends. One friend was a very avid hunter and owned the land we were hunting on, so it was private, and the other was just along for the ride. We were all about 100 yards from my brother's truck, which was parked on a Forest Service road. We all see this large bipedal animal moving quickly through the trees. Immediately, we knew it was too big to be a bear, and the fact that bears don't move like this bipedally, not this quick. We just could not figure out what it was. It walked for about 20 to 30 yards, then dropped down to all fours and disappeared out of sight behind some small trees and brush in a small valley. We all thought it was going to continue its way and walk right past us, but that's not what happened. The creature suddenly reappeared, looking in our direction, and popped up back on 2 legs. Accompanying it was this popping sound. It reminded me of bones cracking or a joint being pulled out. It was gross. My brother, who was closest to the truck, jumped in and grabbing the shotgun. The creature was quickly nearing our vehicle. My brother fired off a warning shot, and it quickly disappeared. We don't know if it ran away, but it concealed itself. I feel like I know what we saw, but it's so hard to believe. It's the closest thing I've ever seen in my life to a werewolf, and I stand by that. I'll never forget the horror I witnessed. It was morning in April, when I went to go check on my pigs in my backyard. I noticed something bad. When I got there, all of them were dead. Around their necks was torn flesh, but it did not look like a person had did this. All the legs and heads were ripped off and thrown about the pen. We never found out who or what killed my pigs, but a farmer a few acres down also lost his livestock. After seeing this, I decided to get a gun for my own protection. Surprisingly, I did not have one yet. I was not expecting the next thing that came. About an hour after finding my pigs brutally murdered, I saw something that still haunts me to this very day. It looked like a large bipedal wolf, walking on its hind legs. It was roughly 6 feet tall and very muscular. I froze in terror as it just stared at me with its red eyes. This is before it ran off into the woods. I had reported my findings to the police, but they laughed at me, said I was delusional. That's when I knew I needed to find out what this thing was for myself. A few weeks go by, and I'm out hunting deer in the woods right near my house. I had a feeling that the same creature had been following me around. I wasn't wrong. And suddenly, I see it walking across the road, about 50 yards away from me. It was definitely not a wolf, or any other animal I'd ever seen. It looked more like a man in its stature, but it was huge. The muscles were bulging, and it had a ferocious face with a very fierce expression and sharp teeth. I shot at it, but it quickly disappeared. I decided to go back home and grab a camera, in case I saw it again. Luckily, I did. It was actually standing in the tree line this time, observing me. I tried taking a few pictures of it, but that seemed to anger it. And suddenly, it began to charge. I barely got away with my life. And after this incident, I decided to go back to the woods to try and find out more about these creatures. I found evidence along the way that pointed to there being more than one of them, and they were definitely not from around here. One day, I was also in the woods tracking a creature that I had been following for weeks now. I believe it was the young of one of these. I came upon it, hiding behind an old oak tree. It was watching a group of deer, as if it was studying them. I tried to take a few pictures of it, before I completely lost my nerve and ran away screaming. That's because this thing noticed me, and I could tell its mother was near. And to this day, nobody has really believed me. The pictures that I managed to get are too blurry to really be evidence. I know for a fact that whatever these creatures are perfectly capable killing machines, and they will not hesitate to take you out. I feel like the only reason they're allowing me to live is because they haven't been ready to kill me yet. Let me tell you a story about back in my middle school days. I grew up in Minneapolis. Honestly, a pretty good city to grow up in. Not too crazy and chaotic like, let's say, New York, but also not small and boring to the point where nothing ever happens because people live the exact same routine day after day. Seasons are great and mostly well defined. So, a kid gets to experience the 4 seasons to their fullest extent. Also, there's a lot of parks all around, which are actually pretty nice for taking nature hikes. In fact, my story takes place right inside one of those parks. Even though they might be beautiful, among them lurks something strange. This all happened when I was in 9th grade. School had organized a scientific expedition, which is just a fancy way of calling a school trip, right inside those parks. I can't quite remember which one it was. I've done some research and I'm like 85% sure it was the Boom Island Park. Anyway, I'm not entirely sure. Schools always had organized this awesome trip that'd last all day long, and we could not be more excited. We all loved the idea of driving somewhere far surrounded by our friends to set out on an adventure. Even though we'd probably be back in time for dinner, everybody had made sure to get their permission slip signed, and we were all eager to set out. Once everybody was set and ready to go, the bus set off. The main idea of the trip was for us to do some activities for our biology class, to learn about quadrats and sample sizes in an environment and whatnot. So, the basic was to set out with our groups, count the exact number of plants from different types of present in a quadrat established by ourselves. Of course, as any middle schooler would do when set loose in the middle of a big green area, the great majority pretended to work, while they basically goofed off and fooled around, just coming up with random numbers to get the task done. I was in one of those groups. We quickly wrote down our sample sizes, saved the data for a lab report when we get back, and began just walking around the place with my friends, interested in getting to know more about the spot. We went around our designated spot for an on-field data recollection, and finally decided to stray a bit more from the forest. We began walking, away from the other groups. We were enjoying the scenery and the fake freedom and independence. This is right when we began hearing some strange noises in the distance. They were these peculiar screeching sounds. At first, we thought it might just be a strange bird, but the sound persisted. We began getting a little bit nervous, especially because after hearing it for a while, it began to sound like a strange, asphyxiated howl. Last thing we wanted to do was to run face to face with God knows what, and prove exactly why a group of 9th graders aren't to be constantly under-supervised, save they get into a tricky situation that might get injured by any source of danger. We had rushed back to our designated investigation area. The day went by and we had a ton of fun. We managed to even get a nice swim in the lake. School was so nice to have an organized day-long trip for activity that takes tops 10 minutes to do. They clearly also wanted us to have fun. The day was soon over, and we were all sent right back into the bus. We were all pretty exhausted, but filled with a sense of satisfaction never experienced before in a school setting. As soon as everybody was seated and ready to leave, the bus took off. We began to approach the exit, and suddenly, the bus abruptly stopped. A few of us lost their balance. The teacher asked the driver what's wrong, but the driver seemed pale. He tried to keep his voice down, but we could all clearly hear him that someone had suddenly crossed in front of the bus. Murmurs began to spread like wildfire. Everybody told their own theory of what the thing might have been. The driver hopped off the bus real quick and began looking around, making sure the thing didn't crash against a vehicle, and finding out if the thing had ended up a bit further down the road. A few moments later, the driver is back, saying everybody is fine and ready to go. He turns the bus on and once again began driving away. Everybody gets back into their positions. Nothing else was truly discussed about the incident. It was probably just an animal. The truth is, though, it was a bit hard to believe. No one has seen an animal move that fast. However, it was a good enough excuse for the teacher. As we drove right outside the park, I propped myself up and stared outside the window. There was nothing, just a lot of trees, and suddenly, a humanoid silhouette, somewhat hidden among the trees. I stared. Was I? The creature had vanished from one moment to another. I became very unnerved. Something knows we're here. I kept on staring, but there was nothing to be seen. And suddenly, again, I almost fell out on my knees. A furry, immensely figured creature with what seemed to be a dog's snout for a face, and I began screaming, pointing it out for the others, but by the time my friends came to give it a look, it had vanished once more. I don't think anybody really believed me. I'm not sure if I believed myself. At this point, it was just a brief moment. However, the Dogman is forever imprinted in my mind. And since I'm apparently not the only person to have ever reported a sighting, I feel a strange sense of relief. In the front of weird and unexpected, it is always better to have somebody to trust. My story begins when I took my girlfriend fishing to one of my favorite spots. My brother and I used to fish here all the time when we were younger, and in the summertime, it was the go-to spot. We used to swim there virtually every day. We would take our canoes and camp overnight. It was a pretty sweet spot overall. So, my girlfriend and I were fishing for about an hour when we heard this zing noise right by us. It sounded like somebody throwing a rock. It wasn't from our side, but rather the opposite shore, where we were fishing beside a small island. After we heard it hit something, we heard a rustling noise and very, very heavy deep breathing. Immediately afterward, there was another zing noise, then more rustling. My girlfriend at this point got terrified, asked me what was going on. I quietly paddled over to the small island to take a look. All I was armed with was a fishing rod and a baseball bat. As I got closer, I could see something moving in the bushes. Then, out came what looked like a huge dog, the size of a cow, red eyes and all. Panicked, I began paddling back to my girlfriend faster than I'd ever paddled before. When I got back, she was as white as a sheet and asked me, was it just my imagination or what? But I told her that was not the case at all. We decided to head back to shore, but on our way there, we heard yet another zing noise, followed by a loud growl. Needless to say, we hightailed it out of there. Also, the growl was so menacing, it was a type of I'm going to kill you kind of growl. When I got home, I did some research on the area and found out there have been numerous sightings of a dogman in that area. I'm not sure what it is that we saw, but I'm guessing that the zing noises were it throwing rocks in our direction. I've never seen anything like this before in my life, and to be honest, I hope I never see anything like it again. Oh, and I wanted to give you an update on the situation. A few weeks ago, I was out hunting deer in the same area where we had saw the dogman many summers ago. I had heard a zing noise come from behind me. I turned around and saw a large black dog. Not as big as the one I saw, but still big. and it was menacing, growling. The hair on its back was standing up. It looked like it was ready to attack. It kind of came out of nowhere. I drew my bow back to a full draw and aimed for the chest, right at the heart, just in case. But when I pulled back, there was almost a flash of light from behind the trees, and the growling stopped. I'm not sure what this flash of light was, but it seemed to distract the dog. After that, it quickly drew its attention to the flash and disappeared. I heard another zing noise signaling that it had gone behind some trees. I'd love nothing more than to hunt in that area again, but I don't really want to see that dog again. Something tells me it's a hell of a lot smarter than your average dog, and it has some sort of pack mentality. Also, the intelligence I saw in its eyes was alarming. If I ever run into that thing again, I'm bringing my shotgun. When I was 15, my brother and I used to go out into the woods and play paranormal investigators. We would make up stories about creatures and ghosts, and try to find evidence of their existence. We were never successful in finding anything, of course. But a few years ago now, when I was about 25, I moved from Massachusetts to rural Florida. There was a big storm during the first few days I moved there, and as a result, my power was out for about a week. When it came back on, I had just gone to bed, and before I went to sleep, I flipped through the channels on the TV. There was a short documentary that said it would be showing live footage of a cryptid traveling through the woods. I was skeptical, but decided to watch it anyway. The footage began with an extreme close-up of what looked like a grayish face with wide black eyes. Then, it panned out to reveal an extremely tall creature walking through the forest at night. It looked almost human, except for the torso, which was very long, and apparently hairless. It had a very lean body, but it walked on two legs. I watched until the footage ended, minus 2 commercial breaks. The next day, I checked online for any more information about this. There wasn't much available on the web, so I did some researching on my own. I even went into the woods near my house and searched for any traces. I couldn't find anything that day, but I did come across a stump with 3 large claw marks on it. They were about 2 feet apart, and looked as if they had been made very recently. I later found out from a local man that there was a creature around here, known as the hellhound. It apparently roamed these woods, and said it was very large and hairy, and resembled that of a werewolf. I've never seen it myself, but I'm certain that maybe there's a connection. I still have the documentary on VHS somewhere. I'll try and upload the footage on YouTube, if I ever find it.